Happy Halloween! Today's video, I'm going to walk you through the costume that I made for myself this year. And it's a few different things in this video. I'm going to show you how I made a few of the pieces, and I'm going to show you a few pieces I already had or that I had made previously, and then I'll show you the final look. So here's the sketch of the costume that I did when I decided to make it. I'd started on another costume at the beginning of the year, and if you go to my Instagram you can see several posts on the progress I made on that. But when it became clear Halloween wasn't gonna happen, I sort of defaulted to a costume that would be a lot cheaper for me to make, so all of these materials are from my stash. This skirt is just a gored gather-top skirt that I whipped up before I was videoing my progress. And this cape is it's a stretch velvet cape. It's made from McCall's 4310. I don't know if that's in print anymore. The pattern has armholes and I omitted those because I didn't need them. This is just a secondary petticoat I whipped up real fast. And here I am going into making the moss. So I pull these fibers out of the fabric till I have a bunch of them. And then I take a pencil eraser against some burlap, that's what I used, any rough surface that I had, and just sort of fuzzed it up into a ball. And once it was sufficiently non-string, I stitched it down, just tacked it down to this base fabric, cut out a little chunk, and it looked like a little chunk of moss. And then I made the hat using those mushrooms you saw at the beginning of the video. I made those first in the project. They are made in the same way that the mushrooms in my earlier video this month were, so I'll have that linked below. This is the making of the chemise. It is 2 sleeve pieces with this bias tape-like, it's not cut on the bias, but band. They're forming channels for elastic to poof up the sleeves. And then there's 2 bodice pieces that are each the full width of the panel, so it's got a lot of volume. And then there are 28 full width of the fabric strips that form the tiers. I only made it to 1 tier within my time restraints, but I plan on adding the other tiers to this ridiculous little fantasy chemise. It's not based in historical anything. So those are all the strips for the tiers. Those are the sleeve pieces. I've already at this point gone ahead and marked the spacing for the channels to be sewn on. And there's the bodice pieces. Here's the elastic I was going to use in the neckline. I actually ended up threading it in there, and it just was too difficult, so I replaced it with a really thin satin ribbon. But this elastic did stay in the project. It's what's going on the armbands. Speaking of armbands, here I am sewing on those channels. Like I said, I've already marked them, so I'm just following a line here. Stitching as close to the edge as I can so there's as much room for that elastic in the channel as possible. As you can see, the fabric is already starting to pool in like a lake to the side of the machine. That will only get worse from here on out with this project. There's just so much yardage involved. Here I'm sewing the front and back panel together down the side seams. These angled cuts on the sleeves and the top are where they join. So the sleeve angle and the shirt bodice angle will be sewn together to form the armpit. And here's that happening, actually. So I've got one of the sleeves flat, it's not sewn into a tube yet. That 45-degree cut up against the 45-degree cut on the bodice piece, right sides together. Actually, it looks like I French seamed that, so it was wrong sides together. And then the seam allowance is trimmed down, it's ironed the other way, and you sew it again so it encases that raw edge. This fabric was a pretty loose weave, and it did fray like crazy. So I'm attaching the little binding for the neck edge here, and the fraying actually kind of bit me in the ass here because that binding is tiny. So the neck is already starting to come away from this binding, which is what the drawstring that holds the whole neck, basically holds the whole garment on my body is threaded through. I'm not opposed to visible mending on this garment though, so I think it'll probably just end up being mostly patches and mending all along the top edge. So, not there yet, but there are definitely a few spots I already need to fix. Hindsight. I believe I'm now hemming the sleeve ends up. These sleeves are a full width of the fabric. It's a 60-inch fabric, so the bell of the sleeve is 60 inches around, minus little seam allowance. So they are substantial. So I'm starting to thread elastic through those arm channels. Just got a safety pin on the end to guide it through. And I stitch the elastic closed after I've got it through the channel. Here I am zigzag stitching all of the edges of all of the tiers and the bottom of the bodice, because this fabric, like I said, it's frays a lot, so I just had to do something to seal it. It did take forever, but I think it'll be worth it when it doesn't fall apart immediately on every tier. So zigzagging the edge and substantial enough seam allowance. Hopefully it'll last for a little while. Then I've got the tier all gathered up and pinned onto the bodice. I'm just stitching them together. And the most satisfying part of gathering a really long gather like this, especially with such loose weave fabric, is being able to pull the entire gather thread out without it breaking. And there it is. And now onto the bodice. This is a princess seam bodice pattern that I just sort of adapt to whatever I need it to be because I know it fits well. So this time I've split it down the front so that it will lace up. And always iron your seams. Always. So here is where I messed up. I'm sewing the side seams together here. I guess I just forgot that this was going to be fully self-lined. So I do end up having to go undo all of this side seam sewing. And then also how I sewed the peplum on had to be changed for the same reason. Here I'm sewing it all into one big circle so it can be sewn all the way around the bottom of the bodice I have assembled. But I do end up having to go in and split that down so the side seams are left open. And that's so that you can sew the lining and the exterior together and still flip them inside out, because once you've sewn that armhole circle, there's no way to turn it inside out anymore. You need to have some seam connected to the armhole open. And I prefer the side seams. So here I've already split those side seams and laid the exterior and the lining together. And I'm sewing up the bottom edge of that peplum, starting a few inches in from the side seam edge. You'll see on this edge here there's a little discrepancy in the seam allowance left over, and that is because I messed up that first time, so I just had to keep it in mind. As long as I remembered what was happening, it was fine. So now I'm sewing around the open armhole from side seam to side seam. And then all the way from the front edge peplum up the front inner side and through the neck hole and back down the other side and around the other front peplum. Now I am clipping all of the curves so that I can turn it right side out and it can have crisp edges. Here is the turning it inside a right side out process. You have to pull, in this case it's the back that is a single piece. You have to pull the front pieces towards the back through their shoulders, which is pretty narrow in this case, and the fabric is a pretty thick, like canvas material, so bit of a challenge. There we go. Now I'm just pushing all those seams open, all those corners out. Now we get to deal with the side seams. So the side seams get pinned together, right sides together, and you use that edge of the peplum that was left over, the edge of the bottom that was left open, to wiggle your way, to wiggle the machine back inside of the garment to get that side seam. It's really hard to explain without you doing it yourself. I'm a kinesthetic learner. I don't know how to explain things to people who aren't. So basically, if you're not here, I can't help you, which is why I'm not a tutorial channel. I'm a look what I'm doing and glean what you may from it channel. But what I'm doing here is closing up the side seams. See? Side seam. Now, to iron that seam is also pretty ridiculous, because you're trying to work the iron through that small opening left at the bottom edge of the peplum. But it's doable and it's worth it. Iron. Then just ironing up the opening that we worked that side seam through so that it can be hand stitched together later. Alright, here I am adding eyelets. I did not want to go and hand make a million little eyelets for this costume, so I opted to use my machine's eyelet function, which is hit or miss at best. Sometimes it just decides to make a tiny little fish shape, or a spiral that isn't connected in any way. It all ended up working out fine, but it is a huge pain, and I don't know why I use it. Here are the photos of the costume. This is my view from under the hat. So I went out with a friend, and we stayed distant from one another and got these good photos. And if you can be in a flowing skirt and a cloak and not spin, then I do not relate to you. I have to spin. There's really showing off how poofy those sleeves are. The cute picture on the ground, and then the next one shows you how you get to the ground when you're wearing 3 skirts and a floor-length cape. I really love how this costume turned out. It's a shame that there's not more happening for Halloween this year. Thank you guys for watching, especially if you've been checking in all month. I'm gonna go back to a weekly schedule, so I'll have a new video on Thursdays from here on out. Please subscribe if you're enjoying them, and I'll have yesterday's video on the screen for you.